Um, I'm really excited to have Ryan here. We have a long affiliation with Mono Lake, and most recently, I guess we supported them on a variety of efforts. One of them is their Modus network, and I'll rely on Ryan to bring you up to date on what's happening with that. I had the pleasure to attend an award dinner for the Mono Lake Andrea Lawrence Award was given to Ryan in 2024, and he's clearly been a very active local and very impressive program there with the Phalaropes, but other aspects of why we need saline lakes and what's happening with saline lakes and what the data will tell us about conservation in general. So, Ryan, anything that you would like to brag about before I stop the introduction there?
That sounds great. Thank you.
All
Yeah,
right.
nothing to add.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm really pleased to see you and looking forward to updates on all of this great stuff that's happening.
Uh, Thank you. Here we go with sharing my screen. All right, we got that.
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, yeah. Thanks everybody for coming to this talk. It's great to see all of those names. If you feel like turning on your video, I support you because it's always nice to see my audience when I'm talking. Um, my name is Ryan, and I'm the science director at Oikonos Ecosystem Knowledge, and I'm going to be talking to you today about our program on phalaropes and saline lake conservation, and about my very favorite place, Mono Lake, and some of my other favorite places that are salt lakes around the hemisphere. So Oikonos, I'm going to give you a little background before we get too far in here. And we're a nonprofit organization. We use science, art, and design and community collaboration to work on imperiled ecosystem conservation. So that mostly for us looks like working on water birds and on restoration and conservation of island ecosystems, just because that's sort of been the focus of the folks that have worked there. But we have a broad mission to work on any imperiled ecosystem. And the places that has taken us have been California, Hawaii, Washington State, Chile, Argentina, and New Zealand actually too. And so there's a sort of a theme there of going around the Pacific and working on places that have seabirds. And one of the places pictured here is the Juan Fernandez Islands, where I also have the privilege to work sometimes in Chile. And we work a lot with local communities in these places, hiring staff that are actually from the places. And about half of our staff is based in Chile. We have a staff of about 20. So this map here shows the locations of our projects that Oikonos works on, and also some of the species. So just to give you a little sampling, like we work on albatrosses in Hawaii, puffins in Washington State. I started out working on rhinoceros auklets in California near Santa Cruz, and pink-footed shearwaters down at the bottom. They breed in Chile and come up to the U.S. and Canada, and they live in the Juan Fernandez Islands down there. But today I'll be talking to you about shorebirds, a slight departure from our seabird theme and the places that we work on shorebirds. As we mentioned, Mono Lake, but as I'll tell this story, the phalaropes have really taken me all over the Western Hemisphere and opened up whole worlds of salt lakes that I never knew existed in Canada and Argentina and Chile. So excitingly, we've been able to form a broad network of people working throughout the hemisphere on these salt lakes, and I've gotten to go to some really cool ones. So I'm just going to start with the basics here. What's a saline lake? A saline lake is a salty lake, and these lakes are typically also alkaline, which means that they have a basic pH, so more like baking soda and less like lemon juice. They're terminal lakes, which means that they don't have an outlet. So the fresh water is going to come into the lake and it doesn't have a place to go. It just evaporates and it leaves salts behind. This makes them often too salty for fish. which results in them having specialized invertebrates, often flies and brine shrimp, that provide lots and lots of bird food. And I don't think that probably the audience tonight needs to be convinced about why we need to care about saline lakes, but they're often an undervalued system. And so here's a few reasons why we should care. So like in this picture, I'm showing a big flock of Wilson's Phalaropes at Mono Lake. It's critical habitat for many migratory birds because there's so much food there, also other wildlife. It's a really interesting system because it is experiencing the intense impacts of climate change now. I think this is getting less novel as we go along, but salt lakes are really experiencing these impacts in the real time. There's a deep history of connection to people with these lakes and symbolism and spirituality around them and connection with indigenous cultures. And importantly, for the towns that are near them, they support the local economy. There's brine shrimp fisheries, and also if you dry up these lakes, it results in horrible toxic dust storms, and nobody wants that. So some of the lakes I'm going to talk about today are in North America, are on this map. Great Salt Lake is the largest salt lake in North America and probably the most famous. Our beloved Mono Lake in California, probably y'all down in LA have heard of Owens Lake, a little south of Mono Lake, and then Lake Abert is maybe a little less well known in southeastern Oregon, but is a very large salt lake there as well. And I have the indigenous names of the salt lakes there because those names have been around for far longer than the current names and are important too. So Mono Lake's original name is Kutzapa in the indigenous language there. And we are very lucky at Mono Lake that it is a very scenic place and it is very beautiful and picturesque. And it's easy to connect to this place because we have the beautiful Tufa Rocks. If you, maybe many of you have been there, we have the Sierra Nevada in the beautiful background there. This is an aerial image of Mono Lake. I hope it's illustrating how it is a closed basin. You have the Sierra Nevada in the front with the snow piling up on it. The snow melts down into the basin and provides the fresh water for the lake. And it doesn't have anywhere to go but this basin. So it's 2.5 times saltier than the ocean currently. And like I mentioned, it's full of alkali flies and brine shrimp. There's no fish. So there is abundant food for the birds. So yummy, yummy alkali flies and brine shrimp. If you're a bird, then you're excited to eat all the flies you can at Mono Lake, like this gull is doing down at the bottom. They'll just be running through clouds of brine flies. They're so dense, and this provides this incredible. You're in the middle of a huge desert, and then suddenly there's a wetland full of invertebrate food. So these are incredibly important sites for migrating birds. And millions of birds use just these handful of really large lakes. But it's interesting because the number of species that specializes on them is relatively small, mostly these 5 and a few other ones. But there's just the huge proportions of the populations of those species go to the lakes. So you can have 100% of the eared grebes in North America using the salt lakes in a year. You can have 90% of the adult Wilson's Phalaropes going, and these species all really rely on them, and they're specialized to be able to ingest that salt water or avoid ingesting it as they're eating these prey. So here's a picture of, I'm going to talk about Mono Lake's history a little bit, and here's a picture of David Gaines, who founded the Mono Lake Committee, reading the newspaper that Mono Lake's destruction was right on schedule while floating in the lake. Happily, that didn't come to pass because of much advocacy and work on Dave's and many other folks' behalf, but Los Angeles City started diverting the water from the lakes in the 1940s. And that they diverted the freshwater streams, so the lake started to dry up from evaporation. In the 70s and 80s, the Mono Lake Committee and partners such as National Audubon battled the city of Los Angeles for many years in court on behalf of the lake. And very long story short is that in 1994, Mono Lake was saved, and they made a California State Water Board decision to divide the water between Los Angeles and Mono Lake with reduced diversions to the city of Los Angeles and setting a target level for Mono Lake. And everybody was really happy because Mono Lake had been saved, and this is really, really good news and really did save Mono Lake. And as I'll talk about later, Mono Lake is still in need of saving, as the Mono Lake Committee's done a great job of telling us, but I'll get to that. So a little personal history about me is I grew up next to Mono Lake and have a strong personal connection there. So that's me dressed as an alkali fly in the Bridgeport 4th of July parade in about 1992. So my parents were the state park rangers at Mono Lake, and my brother there is looking excited to be dressed as a brine shrimp. So for many years, we did the parade, and I've been aware and caring about alkali flies for my whole life, apparently. So it was really exciting for me as a biologist. I've been working on seabirds, and I was able to come back to Mono Lake and start redoing research on the Phalaropes and come back to my hometown where I have a really strong connection. And through that, coming back to where I grew up, it actually expanded the horizons of my work all throughout the Western Hemisphere, and we've formed a really beautiful network of people from Canada to Argentina that care about salt lakes and phalaropes. And the reason for this is because the Wilson's phalarope, unlike any other species, connects salt lakes in North America and South America and relies on them in both places. There's birds in both North and South America that rely heavily on salt lakes, but only the Wilson's phalarope is going between the two places and relying heavily on both places. So that's something that I hope that you come away from this talk with. Another thing I hope you come away with is that salt lakes are very threatened globally, and they're actually one of the most threatened ecosystems globally. And a good example of this is Great Salt Lake that maybe you've heard of in the news lately has shrunk and shrunk from this high point in the 80s to this low point. Actually, it says 2021 there, but in 2022 it got even lower. And I'll be talking more about that. But that is kind of a trend that's happening with salt lakes worldwide. So I'm going to now switch gears to a little background on phalaropes. Who are these birds? We have the Wilson's phalarope and the red-necked phalarope, and this is them in their breeding plumage. It's actually the female's breeding plumage that's brighter than the male's. They have reversed sex roles. And I am a college teacher in my other hat, and I like to do some active participation in my talks. So this is a pop quiz for my audience here, and you're welcome to respond in the chat. But what I'd like to ask you is, which of these birds are red-necked phalaropes? This is the same picture that's behind me, but there's Wilson's phalaropes and red-necked phalaropes in this picture. So
Wow.
take a moment and see if you feel like you know. All right, so you've had a chance to check it out there, and here's the reveal. So those two are red-necked phalaropes with the circles. You might notice they have a little kind of black patch around the eye. They have a little shorter bill than the Wilson's phalaropes. They're a little smaller overall, a little more mottled back. But this is just one of several times I'll remind you tonight that our work is pretty challenging in terms of telling phalaropes apart and counting them accurately, and that's one reason why phalarope science has not been advancing until quite recently when we really started accepting this challenge. So Wilson's Phalaropes range, we have the range map on the right, which is based on eBird, and the circled red part is their breeding range. So they're breeding up in the prairies of Canada, the prairies of northern North America, and they have this beautiful nest hidden in the grass with the speckled eggs that are really hard to see. They're going to make a short migration from there down to do what we call staging at the big salt lakes like Mono Lake, where they're going to fly a relatively short distance, and then they're going to stop there and eat tons of food and grow all new feathers because there's so much food there that they can do that. After which they will fly 5,000 miles or so down to places in South America. And the lines here are roughly reflecting our understanding of that migration route. And then once they're down there, they're going to hang out with flamingos and have this whole life that we haven't imagined up here in North America. But really interestingly down in very similar looking locations to the places that we know them from in North America. And this little wanted poster is sort of what we were some of the things that we were wondering about them in 2019 when we started this work. So the population trend of Wilson's phalaropes, we thought it might be declining, but it was uncertain. The world population estimate was a very rough estimate from the 80s of 1.5 million, and that hadn't been updated since 1986. And one big unknown was what is going on down in South America with this bird. We knew hardly anything about which sites were most important, where exactly they were going, and how the habitat was doing down there. So here's the red-necked phalarope range. It breeds up in the high Arctic, up in the tundra. They migrate along coasts and they also go to salt lakes. So unlike the Wilson's phalarope, only a portion of the population, and we don't know which portion, is coming to stop at salt lakes where they do a similar fattening up. And then they fly down to the ocean off of South America. So they're in the Pacific, way out there in the ocean, where it's also really hard to study them in that blue part of the range map. And same thing, a wanted poster for them. We don't know what their population trend is. They're also quite hard to study. There had been some local declines in some migratory areas that were pretty serious. There's another rough estimate of their world population, but we don't have a good world population up to date with them. And one of the many unknowns we don't know about them is how long do they stay at Mono Lake? With the Wilson's phalarope, we know that they fatten up and then leave on kind of a predictable schedule, but the rednecks, we actually don't know. Are they coming for a few days and just have lots of turnover, or are they coming for months and we're counting the same birds again and again? And that's a big question. So just to reiterate some of the questions we started with, this really started with people just saying to me, like, we don't know why there seems like there's less phalaropes at Mono Lake. That's kind of where this started. So we wanted to know what's going on with phalaropes at Mono Lake, and then also regionally, and how are they responding to these big threats that we're seeing at saline lakes where things are literally drying up or coming back before our eyes. And then we're also doing a lot of study of their migration and movements. And one of the questions there is, do the same individuals go to the same lakes? Do we know, like, are certain populations dependent on Mono Lake and others on Great Salt Lake and things such along those lines? So one challenge there is that these lakes are really big, and Mono is actually one of the smaller ones compared to Great Salt Lake, for example, but it's 12 miles long and 8 miles wide, and phalaropes like to hang out in the middle. So if you've been to Mono Lake, you know there's some nice access points such as County Park or South Tufa along the west side there, but you can't know just from looking at those places what's going on in the middle of the lake. And I've had people say, why don't you just use the eBird data? Because people are out there taking it, but you really can't know. If you see 0 phalaropes at County Park in South Tufa, there might be tens of thousands out in the middle of the lake and you wouldn't know it, and it's very hard to access. Another challenge is you need to kind of look at a regional picture because these birds move around a lot. So we couldn't just look at Mono Lake. We had to look at, we realized quite early on that we needed to try to kind of coordinate everybody and look across the whole region at what's going on. So these 6 sites are where we have succeeded in having everybody survey phalaropes for the last 6 years. And I just want to acknowledge that there are a whole lot of people that have that done these surveys, and that we couldn't have done this without them. And they're listed here next to each of those lakes. So for the methods, I'm going to just briefly skim this, but we do surveys at each site, each of these 6 sites, every 2 weeks from late June to mid-September. That's because the phalaropes are coming in waves, kind of. The Wilsons come first and then the rednecks, and we're trying to catch the peak, and it differs a little bit each year. So we can't just survey once, for example. We have to survey 6 times throughout the summer. And we do 7-day survey windows where we do a survey in each of those windows. And at each of the sites so that the birds can't move around too much. And then we at each of those sites we do different methods. Some are at Mono Lake, we do boat surveys. At Great Salt Lake, there's plane surveys. At other sites, there's shore surveys. But within each of those sites, the methods are standardized. So again, I want to do a little exercise with you to reinforce the challenges that we face as Phalarope researchers, and a little bit of provide a little grain of salt and interpretation of these numbers that can be really large flocks. So you might think, oh, they're just out there doing this. Like my friend Sarah here is looking at this one Phalarope in the water, one Phalarope, done, check. We counted it, we're good, very accurate, it's one bird. So that seems really easy, and it is when we sometimes just get one bird. But sometimes more often we end up with a situation like this, and I'd like to challenge you to try to count how many birds are in this photo. If you want, you can put it in the chat. If you can get which species, you're welcome to put that in there too. So we got 15. I get seeing 15 in the chat. I see 15 Wilsons in the chat. Good, good. So yeah, there are 15 birds in this photo, and they are actually red-necked phalaropes. You can see that little black patch around the eye maybe, but that's pretty good. We're still pretty precise with our crowdsourcing here with getting 15 and without a lot of error. So I suspect some of you have seen this talk before and maybe already know the answer, but how many phalaropes are in this picture is my next question for you. And this is a much bigger challenge, right? So, and we do see situations like this where we're seeing many, many phalaropes. I'm not going to say how many because I want you to count them. So here is another challenge for you. My advice here is to count them in a group of 10 and then sort of count tens up till you get to 100 and then use that 100 estimate to count how many hundreds you see. And if you are inspired to put that in the chat, you may try. I'm seeing 400, 350, 760, 600, 350. We got 1,000 from Paula. And I'll move on from there because Paula's pretty close. So I did an exercise here where I used a program and dotted this photo and counted all of the phalaropes in it, and I got 981. So Paula's 1,000 is pretty close. And there is a tendency for us when we see flocks of really numerous flocks of birds to underestimate them because we're trying to be conservative. And that actually, I think that leads us to have a bias often with new observers, especially to have a low bias. So this is one of the challenges we face. And literally at Great Salt Lake, there will be flying and see a flock of 50,000 phalaropes. And so you can imagine that the errors we're dealing with are maybe plus or minus some thousands when you have a flock of tens of thousands. Okay, I'm going to dive into some results now. And to help you follow along, I have a picture of the bird on each of these graphics that show the data. So that hopefully will help you remember which species I'm talking about, red-necked or Wilsons. And I first just want to start by saying the Mono Lake boat survey data that we're taking is one of the things that provides us a nice spatial snapshot because we go to the same, the dots on this map are the same boat points that we go to each time. The small dots are ones that did not have any birds, and the bigger dots show the magnitude of the bird numbers. And then this is repeat surveys throughout the year in 2020 for the red-necked phalarope. And this kind of also reiterates the point I was making earlier that the birds often are in really remote parts of the lake. This part that has the most red-necked phalaropes in 2020 is way out in the east side of the lake. That's a very hard place to access by car. It's much easier to access by boat, but nobody's usually out on Mono Lake on a boat. So without these kind of surveys, you wouldn't know that there were any birds, any phalaropes at Mono Lake unless you got out there. And then also we're seeing consistent use of this area. And this is why, because it's the heaven of phalaropes where there's tons of flies because the lake is really shallow in that part and has lots of submerged tufa where the alkali flies live out their life cycles on the rocks, and that produces lots of flies. And this is a fun picture of a phalarope hunting the flies by trying to look sneaky. So moving on to another way of looking at the data here, we have the numbers of Phalaropes, and this is looking with the bottom axis is the different surveys that we do throughout the season. The vertical axis is the number of birds that we're seeing, and then we have each year in a different color. So what I'd like you to take away from this graph first is that the Wilson's Phalaropes tend to be at Mono Lake earlier in the summer, and they tend to be peaking around mid-July. But then the other interesting thing here is that we had a huge bump in the number of the high count of Phalaropes, so about 45,000 Wilson's Phalaropes in 2021, and most other years we've had on our surveys about 6,000 to, we had one year about 12 or 13,000. So this is one reason why you can't just look at one lake. You'd be like, why did this happen? We need to look at the rest of the lakes to know why we suddenly got 45,000 in that year. And actually what happened is that Lake Abert in Oregon was dried up that year, and we had a huge influx of Phalaropes to Mono Lake, and that seemed very suggestive of the cause of what might have happened. So this is looking at the same thing with red-necked Phalaropes, and we have each year is a different or each line is a different year. And the first thing to see from this is looking at these 6 years of data now is that the redneck Phalaropes tend to be there in the later than the Wilsons, and they're in mid-August, early September is their peak timing. So that does help us to differentiate them somewhat, but they do mix in July and August. And interestingly, we had in 2023 a record, we found the record number of redneck Phalaropes on Mono Lake in a day of 32,000 and some. And again, we don't really know why this happened, because there's things happening in the Arctic maybe, or in their wintering grounds, that caused this bump in them coming to Mono Lake, but it does help to look at the whole picture regionally. And I just want to pause with looking at graphs for a second for our brains. And this is some fun video of Wilson's Phalaropes feeding, where they spin in little circles to create a vortex to bring the prey to the surface. So these are Wilson's Phalaropes, and there's your brain break. Okay, so moving on to another graph. This I mentioned we do surveys across 6 different sites, and that was really important. So this is looking at that. It's the same thing, except we have years on the bottom axis now. We have number of birds on the vertical axis, and then the circles scale to the number of birds on the vertical axis. And if you only take one thing from this graph, I would take the blue dots are really big, and those are Great Salt Lake. And we're seeing on our surveys there, we'll get high counts of 300,000, 200,000 Wilson's Phalaropes at Great Salt Lake. And if you look at all the other multicolored dots down at the bottom, you see some of them are maybe in the 50,000 to 100,000 range sometimes, but we never really break 100,000 birds at any other site than Great Salt Lake. And there's an order of magnitude more birds at Great Salt Lake than at the other sites. Mono Lake and Lake Abert often have tens of thousands. And it's not to say that those other sites aren't important, but I just want to give you that scale that, wow, Great Salt Lake is really important. And then this is looking at the same thing for red-necked Phalaropes. And same story, really. The red-necked Phalaropes, we have hundreds of thousands at Great Salt Lake. The other sites, we have tens of thousands. And I'm pointing out there that in 2022 with the arrow, that was the lowest year of Great Salt Lake's stand, and that we had relatively no numbers of redneck Phalaropes that year. And I'm going to go back to Wilson's Phalaropes here for a second and show you that 2022, that bottom blue circle, we also had low numbers of Wilson's Phalaropes that year when Great Salt Lake was low. Okay, and then one last thing to look at on this figure here is there's a green dot of Owens Lake in 2023, where it suddenly is much bigger green dot than it ever was in any other year. And I'm going to talk about what happened there because it's a good story. So Owens Lake, as we may be familiar with, was a shallow salt lake, similar to Mono Lake in some ways, but shallower in Eastern California, that city of Los Angeles started diverting the Owens River, which fed it over 100 years ago, and it dried up pretty rapidly, and it caused really big dust problems and also a huge loss of habitat. So the top picture there is kind of the worst days of the dust problem at Owens Lake, and it's much better now that the Department of Water and Power of Los Angeles is managing it. As you can see on the bottom picture, there's kind of a series of sort of managed looking squares and ponds that in the foreground, and they manage the dust there. But this picture in 2023 at the bottom shows actually Owens Lake was there for really the first time since it had dried up. So many decades in 2023, because there was a huge wet snow winter in 2022, 2023. And there's so much water coming down into Owens Lake that it made the lake reappear. And also the water hung around in the dust control ponds for longer than normal. And this was quite amazing because we normally see about 1,000 to 2,000 individuals of each species at Owens Lake. And that's a huge triumph because there's any habitat there at all. Those are just using the dust ponds. But in 2023, there was about 30,000 of each species there, an order of magnitude bigger than had been there. And probably the first time that many Phalaropes had used it since 100 years ago when it was dried up. So this was a really happy story showing that if you provide more habitat and more water, the system can bounce back quickly for these salt lakes, and that the Phalaropes will respond pretty much immediately. And unfortunately, there is not as much water now, and the lake is is kind of back to the status quo. But that was quite a moment of showing what could happen. So on the flip side of the habitat story, we have Lake Abert in southeastern Oregon. This is another large, shallow salt lake, and it is not usually dry. It's usually had water in it. But in the last 10 years, it's dried up twice completely. And it had not dried up since the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s before that. And again, this is because of water diversions, mainly for alfalfa in this case. But there it is in April 2021 being a lake, and there it is in June 2021 being a lake bed. And we've seen a really obvious response of the Phalaropes to that situation too, where this is looking at all of the Phalaropes of both species at Lake Abert. And in 2021-22, when the lake was completely dry, or almost completely dry, the numbers of Phalaropes were much lower, and then they went back up once the lake had water in it again. And the only reason there's any Phalaropes there, I think, is because there's some localized springs that come out straight into the lake bed that were providing a small amount of habitat. Okay, just a couple more graphs and then we'll be through the graphs, but these are important ones. So this is looking at all of these sites combined into kind of one regional total for each year. And this is Wilson's. And so this is sort of what's the population trend figure. And if you look at this graph, you say there's not really a trend. It's going up and down, and it's kind of flat if you kind of look at it as a whole. But the average there is about 300,000 birds. And I would say it's really good news that this trend is pretty flat. It means that they're not crashing right now. But if you look at the average of about 300,000 and you compare that to numbers, the one time we really had a nice comparison before is in 1986 when there was about 500,000 birds at the same site, at the same 6 sites. So that's 200,000 birds less than back then. Of course, that's only 1 year, but we do have some data we can look at from the historic data from these sites at the individual level. So what we're looking at here is Wilson's Phalaropes. Great Salt Lake is in green, and that's a good one to focus on here. You can see in the 80s and 90s, there were some years where there was 600,000 or 400,000 Wilson's Phalaropes just at Great Salt Lake. And then in the more recent years, we're seeing between 200,000 and 300,000 there. So like, we're still seeing solid numbers at Great Salt Lake, but I think what we're missing is these really large peak years of 600,000 there that have not been seen. We need a longer time series to really know what's going on here, and we're working on that, but we haven't seen a big year like that in our time. And Lake Abert has been up and down with the numbers and depending on how much water is there. And really at Mono Lake, we are using slightly different methods than the historic data used, but in the 80s, there was regularly 50,000 birds at Mono Lake, and we've only seen 1 year in our surveys where we had anything close to that. So it seems like there are some indications of decline there too. And then here is the same thing for redneck phalaropes, but I don't have any historic comparisons to show you because there weren't any research going on that in the same way. So yeah, again, we have sort of a uncertain trend going on. It would be nice to have another 10 years of data if I if I have the stamina for that. And we're getting averages about 175,000 birds over these areas. And I'll just mention again that these areas are concentrating the population. So this is a large portion of the world population, especially Wilson's phalaropes. Okay, so to summarize from the surveys, what we've learned in our last 6 years, now we're going to be doing our 7th year. Wilson's phalarope numbers have declined since the 1980s in North America, maybe less so since the 90s when they had already declined. And this is corroborated by other lines of evidence from the breeding areas and a few other places, but this is one of the best indications we have from our surveys. And there we've seen some really nice responses to habitat creation and to habitat loss, which really show the phalaropes responding to these things in real time. And we didn't really expect to see that necessarily. These things just happened as we were studying them, and it was really interesting to see the response. And Great Salt Lake is still, as we already knew, the most important phalarope site, which is good news that it still is going strong. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears again here, and we're going to go to South America and follow the Phalaropes down to their wintering grounds down in South America. And this picture, if you looked at it and didn't look at the flamingo, you might think it was the Eastern Sierra or, you know, Owens Lake or Mono Lake with the mountains in the background. But there's flamingos, and it's a very similar habitat, but it's in the high Andes, and this is the kind of habitat that they're using down there. I don't have time to talk about the threat of lithium mining in this region, but if you ask me in the questions, I'd be happy to talk about that. So happily, there's a really awesome crew of people that are working on phalaropes down in South America, and we've connected with them and have an international network of people that are interchanging and going back and forth between these two places. So our partners at Manomet led a survey in 2020 of all of the habitat of the Wilson's phalarope and surveyed all shorebirds throughout all of South America, which is an incredible challenge to survey all these sites in the high Andes, very inaccessible sites and places like that. So hundreds of sites were surveyed, and we ended up with a population estimate of 1 million for the Wilson's phalarope, because basically they should all be down in South America at once at this time of year, and we think we counted most of them. And the old population estimate was 1.5 million from the 80s. Not the same methods, but again, an indication of decline there in population numbers. A little more about this survey: 753 sites were monitored in, I think, 4 countries. And I was leading the Chile part with Oikonos and went to some very remote and exciting places to go in Chile, out in the high Andes. But one place really stands out as in utmost importance in South America, and that is a place called Laguna Mar Chiquita in Argentina. And the scale of this lake is quite enormous and hard to visualize, but there's a satellite image of it. It's right in central Argentina in the flatlands, and it's 14 times the size of Mono Lake. So here's my crude image of showing 14 Mono Lakes put on top of Mar Chiquita. In case you're familiar with the size of Mono Lake, that gives you some scale. This is an enormous lake, and when you're on the shore of it, you can't see the other side. This is a picture I took from a plane of it, and you can't see the other side from the plane. The sun sets into the water there. So it really is, it's in English, it would be called the little lagoon, the lagoon that's a little ocean, would be the translation. And it really is like an inland ocean. So this picture here is showing a huge flock of phalaropes, and there's been, in 2020, there was 500,000 phalaropes at Laguna Mar Chiquita, and that's been repeated many times over the years at surveys there. So what we're looking at in this picture is flamingos up in the top of the bigger white dots, and then the small white dots are phalaropes. So that kind of gives you the scale of the flock there. And imagine trying to count those accurately. That is one of our challenges. So Laguna Chiquita is a really important place. It was protected as a national park in 2022, so that's some really good news. And now I'm going to switch to another gear and talk about tracking phalaropes. And this is something San Fernando Valley Audubon has supported with the Motus Towers, so I'm excited to share this with you. Here's a picture of a male Wilson's phalarope from Saskatchewan, Canada, that we tagged with a transmitter that you can see the antenna there. And we have had challenges with catching them, but we have successfully tagged 63 Wilson's phalaropes around the Western Hemisphere since 2023. And this is a big deal, especially for us researchers, because there had been no Wilson's phalaropes tagged before 2023. So we're learning, everything we learn is new and exciting. And we tagged them in Saskatchewan and in California at multiple sites, Great Salt Lake in Utah, and also recently in Argentina. And the way this works is this really tiny tag can go on this really tiny bird because there's external receivers that keep the tag size low because they don't have to carry a battery. And they're called the Motus network. They look like these antennas that are here in the picture. There's about 2,000 stations now, and there's more going up all the time. And San Fernando Valley Audubon helped support the Mono Lake Motus Towers that are now, we have one functional and there's 3 more coming this summer. So that's really facilitated our work at Mono Lake to do tagging of the birds. And the plus side is you also get any other species that's been tagged. So it's a really useful investment. And again, there'd been sort of a 30-year pause in studying phalaropes before we started doing it. And our previous understanding is illustrated here from Joe Gell's 1988 paper of the birds breed up in Canada, they go to Mono Lake, they fly straight 5,000 miles to South America, and then they hang out on the wintering grounds that I described. And that's believed to be a nonstop flight because they gain so much weight, they fly nonstop from Mono Lake to Ecuador. And this is based on observations and the best available technology at the time. And now we're hoping to find out all the gritty details of it by putting tags on them and seeing what they're doing. So again, we've tagged in these various sites. Here's some pictures of it. This involved a lot of trial and error of figuring out how to catch phalaropes. They're really hard to catch. There's a picture of the tag on the left. And I'm gonna talk to you about one particular phalarope because I think that'll illustrate the story and one story, and there's so many stories out of this tagging data, but this will show the journey of one bird that we caught at Tule Lake in August of 2023. And we caught it at Tule Lake because we were struggling to catch them at Mono Lake, but it worked better to catch them at night from boats at Tule Lake up in Northeast California. That white dot is where that bird was tagged. And then they were detected at Ash Meadows, Nevada, which is out near Death Valley, about a week later, that first green dot. And then just a day later, they were detected at this very tiny pond in the Mojave Desert. I zoomed in on it and was like, this is a little tiny, like, it looks like a little speck in the desert that they flew by or maybe hung out and rested on. And then they went to the Salton Sea shortly thereafter. And then we did not detect them for the whole rest of the season until they came back north because there's not very many Motus towers in South America at this point. So this is the same bird, and we did detect it again after it went presumably down to South America, came back. The blue dot is the blue line is what I just showed you, and then the yellow line is the subsequent movements. And the dotted lines indicate that there was a long time between these two sightings, so this straight line probably isn't accurate, but basically we saw it again in June 2024 in Saskatchewan in Canada, and it was probably breeding there. And then the bird flies just a few weeks later down to Great Salt Lake to do the staging. And this was a female, so she probably laid her eggs and then left to the male to take care of them, as this species does, and pieced out and said, you take care of all that, and I'm going to go to Great Salt Lake and eat. This bird was at Great Salt Lake for about a month, and then we detected it again in a coastal lagoon in Sonora, Mexico, in August. So that was interesting too, because we've been seeing a lot of birds using coastal lagoons in Mexico, and we didn't realize really that they were using those lagoons, or that was an important habitat for them. So that's just one of many things we've learned. And then the end of this story, but hope maybe not the end, but the end up to now, is that this bird was detected at Laguna Mar Chiquita and was our first bird detected there in September, and was there detected repeatedly September and October because they got a tower up at Laguna Mar Chiquita. And it's one of the few towers in South America at this point. So this bird proved to us a few things, and one of them is that we tagged it in California, but then it later went to Great Salt Lake. So that means that maybe they're choosing to go different places each year with where they migrate to for the staging. So this is a really overwhelming map that I'm just gonna flash at you here, that has all of the tagging data from all the birds that we've tagged to date. And you can look at this on the MODIS website. It's open to the public to see this. So just to interpret this, the blue lines are birds tagged in Canada that we put on the breeding grounds, and then the purple lines are ones tagged at Great Salt Lake, and the orange lines are ones tagged at Mono Lake, and the green dots are places they were detected. So if you just look at the blue lines, the birds in Canada, many of them went straight down to Great Salt Lake, and there's a pretty clear connection between this region of Saskatchewan and going to stage at Great Salt Lake. We haven't seen any Canada birds in California, so maybe they don't go there. Great Salt Lake, if you look at the purple lines, we did not expect this, but the birds went to the Gulf of Mexico before they were not detected again. And one of those birds was detected at Laguna Mar Chiquita. And so that was something new, because we thought they went over the Pacific, but it appears maybe they're going over the Gulf of Mexico. And then the orange birds, they're using the inland and stopping at small wetlands in the Southwest and then coastal lagoons in Mexico more than I'd say we realized. So there's still a lot to learn. In the old paradigm that the birds fly straight to Ecuador after leaving a place like Mono Lake is very possibly true for many birds, but we wouldn't be able to detect them out over the ocean. So there's still a lot to learn. All right, switching now once again to conservation here. How does this all add up to a conservation? What can we do for these birds? And this is a question that I asked myself and debated for a while, and I landed on yes. Are phalaropes the polar bears of saline lakes? And yes, they are. By which I mean they are a iconic species that can be used to help bring awareness to this threatened ecosystem, and it's a very threatened ecosystem that's threatened by climate change. And if we lose it, the birds may go extinct because they are tied to saline lakes. So I mentioned they're one of the most threatened ecosystems worldwide. The reason for that is primarily because we're diverting freshwater inputs from the lakes. And when it's been investigated thoroughly, it tends to be, the answer is that it's more that we're diverting water from them and less that the climate is changing and heating up. The climate is exacerbating this issue, but if we stop diverting so much water from these lakes, they would still be in decent condition. And that's good news because the saline lake problems are solvable, that means, and Mono Lake provides us a really nice example of how, yes, they're challenging problems, but they can be solved. So again, Great Salt Lake, as I mentioned, is the most important place for phalaropes. It reached its low stand in 2022. It shrunk by over 50%, and it reached a salinity level that year that was too high for even the brine shrimp and the alkali flies to survive and reproduce. So it was literally on the verge of collapse in 2022. Luckily, we got a very wet winter that year and the lake came back up, but it was a very big warning sign of what might happen in the near future again. And one of the things that happened as that lake dried up in Great Salt Lake was that the rocks that the alkali flies use to reproduce on, called microbialites there, they were becoming exposed. And about 40% of those rocks became exposed in 2022. And that meant there was no flies for the birds to eat on those rocks. So the fly researchers that checked out the situation there that year found that, yes, there was a lot fewer flies that year. And we, as I mentioned earlier, there was fewer phalaropes there that year. So I'll make this point repeatedly. The survival of Wilson's phalaropes is tied to Great Salt Lake, and huge proportions of the population can be there. 90% of the adults can be at Great Salt Lake at once. And it rose and got saved by a very wet winter for now, but it's still on the verge of collapse, and now it's dropping again after that big winter. And this is a billboard that our friends at Grow the Flow Utah put up that in Salt Lake City that shows the lake stage or the lake level that it's currently at in February 2025. And it's at the same level it was at in 2021 before it almost collapsed the subsequent year. So I'm happy that they have these billboards up and that this Grow the Flow is a really great organization that's advocating for Great Salt Lake, among many other really inspiring people that are working on behalf of Great Salt Lake in Utah. I also mentioned Laguna Mar Chiquita is shrinking. It did get protected as a national park in 2022, and you can see here it has shrunk a lot in the last few years. And unfortunately, the water situation there is pretty challenging to get a handle on. There's just much less documentation of how the water is being diverted and less strong water rights in some cases. So what about Mono Lake, the place that maybe most of us are the most familiar with? Mono Lake, I like to say is one of the, or I think it probably is the best protected saline lake in the world. And unfortunately, that's still not enough protection for it, but it is the only one with a legally protected water right. That's very special that we have that for Mono Lake. However, it's still 9 feet below the level that was mandated in 1994 for the lake to come up to. And this is me and Jeff McQuilkin, the director of the Mono Lake Committee, showing with his cool pole how where the lake level ought to be at the top of that pole if it had reached the management level. And it was supposed to reach the management level 10 years ago. So it's very overdue for it to reach it. And basically what's happening is they're still diverting some amount of water to Los Angeles. And the committee is advocating to just pause that water diversion until the lake can come up, because the continued diversion in dry years is taking away the benefits of the wet years, and we're just not getting enough water. So this all sounds pretty challenging and like a lot of really big challenges, and they are, but if we continue to work as so many good people are doing on behalf of these lakes locally, and we think of them as a hemispheric network, and remember that the Phalaropes need more than just Mono Lake, they need Laguna Mar Chiquita and many other lakes too. I think that the Phalaropes can help us accomplish saving these special places. And sharing the story of the Phalaropes is something that we've been doing. Maybe you saw this article, the 2024 spring edition of Audubon magazine had a cover story feature about this work I'm talking about with the Phalaropes, and that has a readership of over 2 million people. So it got a really big audience there, and you can search Audubon magazine Phalarope and you will find that story online. And then putting our science into action, we also filed a endangered species petition to list the Wilson's phalarope as threatened in last year. And a petition sounds like a bunch of signatures, which it is, but it's also a 100-page scientific document that I spent the better part of the year before that writing about how everything we know about phalaropes and their threats. And I became more and more convinced that yes, they really do. They do fit the definition of a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. I can get in more into that in questions if you would like, but basically this has really helped set a fire in Utah to get people moving because they're scared of the Endangered Species Act and the federal intervention coming. I can hear you thinking that, you know, in this Trump administration, we're probably not going to have this get accepted, but it has done a lot of good even before the current situation with getting attention to this issue and getting local movement going in Utah. So continuing work, we're going to continue these surveys and tagging. I was just mentioning to Richard at the start of this, we have a federal grant that is half of our budget this next year that has been paused. So we'll see how that goes this year, but we will be continuing the work, publishing on them and hoping to research redneck phalaropes more. You notice this talk was mostly focused on Wilson's. And then also I'll be testifying in the new Mono Lake Water Board hearings as an expert witness on phalaropes this summer, or sometime this year, hopefully, if they get those, they're planning to get the new water board hearings going to decide should we actually stop diversions to Mono Lake or not. So to wrap up, is there a future for phalaropes and saline lakes? I sure hope so, and we need to all keep working on saline lakes and appreciating them, and keeping in mind that we love Mono Lake and maybe we all have a special saline lake in our hearts, but we need to think about the big picture to help the phalaropes survive. So thank you to the volunteers that have helped with this project in many ways. And I just want to plug that we do another survey I didn't talk about called the Intermountain West Shorebird Survey, where we walk the whole lakeshore of Mono Lake and we count all the shorebirds that occur out there. And that is going on April 26th and August 16th this year. So you can get in touch with me if you'd like to come to Mono Lake and volunteer. And we have many partners and funders, and I want to thank all of them and acknowledge that a lot of what I was talking about was their work. And yeah, we have a really beautiful network and a Phalarope working group from people from many different countries that have been really vibrant and helped move all this along. And yeah, you can get in touch with me at that email address, and also just plug that we are a nonprofit, and your support is much appreciated if you're inspired to donate, and that's the link down there at the bottom. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
So Ryan, I asked people to put questions in chat, so I think you can
Okay.
take a look at chat and maybe join some questions together. There's some very interesting side thoughts that came up, and I'm eager to hear your answers.
All right. Okay, so the Wilson Phalarope migrates 5,000 miles to spend their winter in a climate similar to their breeding areas in summer. Yeah, that is a good point. And the reason they're doing that is because it's summer down there, and it's winter up here. So there's not any food at Mono Lake, for example, in the winter, but there is down at Chiquita. So they're basically, just relying on that saline lake habitat throughout their whole cycle. And then somebody mentioned, how about a lawsuit for an established water level? I'm assuming at Great Salt Lake, or is that a can of worms? That is a can of worms, but actually the Center for Biological Diversity did file a lawsuit based on the public trust doctrine, which is what was successfully used at Mono Lake, advocating for Great Salt Lake to be considered a public trust that should be preserved in its own right, and yet you can't just dry up. So that is a lawsuit that's proceeding. It depends on state laws, and unfortunately, Utah's state law might not be as strong as California's when it comes to that, but it's underway. Okay, also, I'd love to hear your comments about the effect of lithium mining on the habitat of phalaropes. Yeah, so lithium mining is a really big threat, and probably as big, if not maybe bigger in the future for South America as some of these other threats. And that zone that I talked about is called the Lithium Triangle, the Bolivia, Chile, Argentina zone. And essentially, lithium is just exploding as a resource extraction, and that zone has a great deal of lithium in the world and is rapidly being developed. And lithium uses a lot of groundwater where they're pumping up the subsurface water and then they're evaporating it to extract lithium. And that in these really arid places, these are some of the most arid places in the world, like the Atacama Desert, where they hardly get any rainfall. It's using the groundwater, which can dry up the surface water of these little small areas of surface water that do exist there. So this is sort of an understudied and threat, and people are trying to get on top of it, but it's basically like this whole zone is being rapidly developed, and we're trying to work on what can we save here. If the whole zone is being developed like this. And fortunately, my colleagues in South America are working on that, but it's a hard one. Somebody asked why no flamingos at Mono Lake. Ooh, that's a little out of my wheelhouse with the paleontology, but I do believe there used to be flamingos in the region way back in the fossil record, but somebody can contradict me on that if you'd like. And they just didn't survive to the present day in North America, but I think that we ought to have flamingos. Let's see. How long do phalaropes live, and do older birds serve as guides to youngsters so that they might serve also as guides to alternative foraging sites? These are good questions. I'm not actually sure off the top of my head the number of how long they live, but I suspect it's less than 10 years. So they do have some lifespan to learn things. And we really don't know, do older birds serve as guides to youngsters and how, how they make decisions about where they're going. We're just barely scratching the surface on tagging to understand, which habitats they're even using. But I sure hope so. And some positive like reason to hope that maybe they do communicate with each other and tell each other where to go is when Owens Lake became flooded like that. I don't know how they knew, but they seemed to know that there was a good habitat down there, unlike most years, and they just went down there. So how they figure that out is still a mystery. All right, how does variability in salinity and alkalinity in the lakes affect the availability of shrimp and flies? This is a question that all the Phalarope researchers are sitting around with each other being like, how do we study this? How do we figure this out? Because yeah, this is a question of linking the bird abundance with sort of the actual water and invertebrates in the lakes together is challenging. But I can say that if the lakes get too fresh, then you lose the salt adapted invertebrates. And if the lakes get too salty, then you lose them too. So there's sort of a happy threshold for these invertebrates where it's salty enough to keep out any other kinds of life forms, but it's not too salty for them to die. So there's a sweet spot there. Okay, there's a vacuum in the background. If you can hear it, I apologize. What's the likelihood of multiple saline lakes drying up in the same year and the effect on phalaropes? Um, this is a good question. There tends to be across North America and the Great Basin, a similar climate where if we're all getting a wet year, we're all getting a dry year. There's definitely differences, micro differences in the regions, but I'd say it's kind of across the board that dry years are drier in all the places that we're talking about. So I think that the worst case scenario in my mind there is that Lake Ebert and Great Salt Lake would both dry up at the same time. And really, that's why we need this redundancy where if Great Salt Lake goes and the other lakes aren't there, then it's really bad news. And luckily, Mono Lake is really deep, and it also is in better shape than the other lakes. So it's an important refuge. But you're not going to be able to post all the Phalaropes from Great Salt Lake at Mono Lake because it's just a smaller place. All right, lots of questions here. This is great. At Laguna Mar Chiquita, what is the food source? That's a good question too. They have brine shrimp at Laguna Mar Chiquita. They also have some fresher areas where they have like water boatmen kind of insects that Phalaropes are known to eat. But we don't really know what they eat at Laguna Mar Chiquita. And my colleague Marcella, who works down there, was doing her PhD on phalaropes, and she was faced with the choice of, do I shoot them to try to look at their stomach contents to see what they eat, or do I discontinue this research? And she chose to discontinue the research, which I support because shooting phalaropes is not what any of us want to do. There are techniques to try to do this, but they involve capturing the birds, which we're getting better at. So like looking at the genetics in their poop or stable isotopes and things like that. Survival rate from the breeding season, how many newborns survive the migration? That is a question that I don't know, but doing something like trying to get a handle on what's the breeding success going on on average, and then how does that relate to the numbers we're seeing at the saline lakes would be a really wonderful connection that we have not yet been able to make. And part of that is because there's not really, they're scattered all over the place in low density colonies, so it's hard to study them all at once. All right. I think I'm hitting all the questions here. How will lack of federal funds affect your work? That is a good question that I am pondering myself. Normally, we haven't had too many federal funds for this, but this year I actually had a shared grant with the Argentinian team that was a federal grant that was supporting our continued surveys at Mar Chiquita and at Mono Lake and also doing tagging at each place. And that that grant is likely to go away at this point. We're unsure what's happening with it. But it will take about half of our budget away for this year and might mean that we don't have the funding to do the tagging part, but we will be doing the surveys this year. So We're still waiting to see what happens with that. But luckily we do have some other sources of funding. However, our colleagues down in Argentina are very dependent on funding from the federal government too, from the U.S. Forest Service International Program, and they actually had some USAID money that has already gone away. So this affects not just the United States, but people around the world, and definitely our Phalarope work. And how much is the tagging part of the grant? The tagging part of the grant, let's see, we're losing about $50,000 of funding this year. And that is how much we're losing. So I'd say I need $25,000 if you're asking. But anything will help. So talk about the Argentinian student exchange program. This is a wonderful program. I didn't really talk about all the human connections that the Phalaropes have helped bring about, but we have formed an international Phalarope working group. We have people from 6 or 7 different countries. We had an in-person meeting at Chiquita last year. This has been really vibrant, and we've had a lot of exchange, and something that has come out of it is this wonderful student exchange where high school students from Mono Lake have gone to Argentina, and high school students from Argentina have gone to Mono Lake as part of this program called Experiencia Ambientalia, which the Mono Lake Committee and Manamet and this other Fundación Líderes de Anzanusa are running. And they have this very inspiring program in Argentina where they have hundreds and hundreds of teenage youth that are participating in events, and they do like a forum at Laguna Mar Chiquita where the winners of these events get together, and then some of the students get to do the exchange. So that has been the vision of my colleague Marina, who is really trying to get us to connect these communities with the youth, and obviously having new inspired leaders come about is what is really going to help these lakes. So that you can learn more about that from the Mono Lake Committee folks if you want to learn more about that, but that is a great program. So yeah, I think that's all the questions there. Any others?
Could I give a wrap-up question for you?
Yeah.
You're seeing funding challenges, you're seeing tagging challenges, you have questions, a lot of questions that you want to answer. If you were to predict which questions you would focus on and you would give us results for at next year's presentation, where do you think your focus is, given all the concerns, problems, and where results are going?
Yeah, that's a great question that I've been pondering myself. And one thing that I'm really keen to do is to connect this to helping conservation at the lakes. And that can be a challenging connection to make between science and conservation. And I was very pleased to get the opportunity to do the endangered species petition. That also came with some scientifically some questions about like, is it okay to be advocating for the species, etc. But I decided yes, it was very much a scientific basis for it. And I felt like that was really a culmination of some of this research in terms of being able to put it to use to help save Great Salt Lake in a way that we could actually move the needle on. And I'm still thinking about that, like what's the best direction to go. We'll continue this research and see what happens. And I think that something that I don't want to see, but that we could see, is if the lakes continue to decline, then we'll be seeing these birds declining and adding some urgency to that question. But I'm still really actively trying to think of ways to connect the dots here to conservation. I'm also happy to be participating in the new water board hearings for Mono Lake and being able to contribute the story of Phalaropes there. The Phalarope story isn't going to save these lakes by itself. The Endangered Species Act part, if it were to pass, would be a big contribution toward it. But I think sharing the story is really what I want to keep doing, and continuing to develop it, and that can be a piece of the advocacy toward these lakes. I'm thinking of expanding more to tagging red-necked phalaropes, trying to learn more about what they're doing, trying to connect to their marine habitat. And then I've also talked to people about studying eared grebes, because eared grebes have gotten likewise very little attention, and we now have the capacity at Mono Lake to do more work on them.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to talking with you shortly about, what would be key points where we could help, and,
Awesome.
the most efficacious support, knowing that we don't have bottomless pockets either.
Of
But
course. Yeah.
there are, we ought to look for the best opportunities. And before I give it
Yes.
back to Kathy to sign off, I want to apologize. The first announcement that I sent out for this month's talk also talked about our next month's talk from from Sharon Jones, is that right? From California Audubon, and I mistakenly put March 23rd as the date. In your subsequent follow-up, the reminder notice, I fixed that. The actual date of next month's presentation and meeting is March 27th. So Kathy, you want to take it away there?
All right. Well, thank you for that clarification. And thank you, Ryan, for a very interesting and very timely talk. We wish you all the best in your continued research. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you next month. And as always, check out our brand new website for all the latest information on our walks and activities. We'll see you there, and good birding. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
That's great update. I really appreciate it.
All right.
There we go.